Good morning. My name is Eric Warden. Today's topic is mental health illness. More specifically, I'm going to discuss a particular demographic that suffers more from mental health issues than any demographic in America. But just to give you some general statistics about mental health in this country, especially among the adult populations, age ranges 35 to 44 have seen an increase in mental health issues over this last year, increasing from 31% to 45%. In the 18 to 34 age range is above 50% for mental health illnesses. Those two demographics make up over half of the adult population in America, and also account for almost all of the U.S. service members actively serving today. Between the years 2016 and 2020, it was reported that 456,293 service members suffered from some form of mental illness or defect. Before I discuss the main topic for today, which is going to be mental health and the stigma surrounding mental health in the military, I'd like to give you a little bit of context on the main cause of mental health illness in the military, and what has perpetuated the stigma surrounding mental health. So dating back as far as we could possibly, as far back as we could possibly go, mental health in combat has been an issue. It's the earliest recorded evidence of mental health illness due to combat-related experiences can be seen in China in 1100 BC, but we'll stick to instances of mental health illness in U.S. conflicts in the past. Look at Civil War era. It was referred to as nostalgia or soldier's heart. At that point, they didn't even know that it was a mental health issue. They really felt that that stress due to combat was service members missing their families, missing the lifestyle that they were accustomed to. They didn't even want to admit that there might have been a psychological component to what they were experiencing. Although, if you look at the conditions that Civil War era service members experienced, in the field, it was atrocious. Poor living conditions, poor health care, poor nutrition, extended days in the field, long exposures to combat, a lot of downtime in a combat arena, all leading to unimaginable mental health issues in those particular instances. We move on to World War I. Excuse me. Still, our government officials refuse to recognize that there might be a psychological component to mental health issues in the military. It was deemed as just standard fear when a service member exhibited behavior or traits that were out of the norm or kept them from being effective in the field. Ultimately, over time, they determined that shell shock which was a term during World War I, to refer to behavior and traits exhibited by service members during World War I. But they reported that shell shock was due specifically to the physical effects of the Germans dropping shells onto the battlefield, and the only ones experiencing shell shock were the ones that were close to the impact of the shells. Towards the end of World War One, it was admitted that shell shock was being experienced by service members that were nowhere near where the shells were being dropped, and that's where sort of the idea that maybe there might be more to these mental health issues that were occurring regularly, among the service members in country. Ultimately, by the end of World War One, shell shock was changed to war neurosis. I think, in my personal opinion, these changes in terms and terminology and descriptors for mental health issues were just a way to excuse the symptomology away, so that there wasn't any care that was needed or provided, and two, that they could put these service members back in the conflict. Our military mental health professionals did seek advice from other foreign allies about how to treat behaviors and traits exhibited by these service members. French primarily had a form of field psychiatry that seemed to work well. We ultimately termed it forward psychiatry, where the psychiatrist would actually go into the field closer to frontline battle and address mental health issues close to the front lines, try to offset some of the extended symptomology, and ultimately try to get the service members back in the fight. There was some success from this method of treatment, but unfortunately, it didn't continue. And moving into World War II, there wasn't much lessons learned from what we weaned from our Allied forces about forward psychiatry. Instead, our government officials, policymakers, and lawmakers decided that pre-screening for mental health issues was really the best way to ensure that our service members weren't experiencing any combat trauma. They felt that those susceptible to mental health issues, had they had issues already, and it wasn't a result of combat that saw the rise in symptomology. It was really the fact that they were already experiencing mental health issues prior to their entry into service. As a result, 1.6 million people were rejected due to potential mental health issues, and that the government felt like they were doing their due diligence to ensure that we didn't have the same issues that we experienced in World War One. Ultimately, at the end of World War One, the United States ended up spending $42 million on veterans from World War One to provide psychiatric care due to combat stress. There was a reintroduction of forward psychiatry during World War II, but so much faith was placed in the concept of forward psychiatry that one of the leading generals during that time, General Bradley, made it a policy that terminology for mental health had to be downgraded to combat exhaustion, suggesting that rest was the only thing that was needed to heal any combat stress or again, behaviors or traits that were being exhibited by the service members that were unruly or out of the ordinary or counterproductive to the war effort. Moving on to the Korean War, there was a slight glimmer of hope that was present once the Korean War was in full swing and America was involved. They did see a rapid rise in combat exhaustion in the beginning stages of the Korean War, which prompted the mental health professionals in the military to introduce a 3-phase treatment plan. Phase 1 consisting of the psychiatrist, who was also joined by a psychologist, a social worker, and then certain members of units that were forward deployed were enlisted to aid in recognizing and differentiating certain, mental health symptomology amongst our service members that were deployed. The second phase was something called Team KO, where they actually had mobile mental health facilities that would rotate to different bases and provide care. And then ultimately, phase 3 was evacuation from the field and treatment in either Japan or in the United States at military hospitals. This saw a drastic decrease in psychological casualties and combat fatigue, but unfortunately it did not cross over into our next conflict, which was obviously the Vietnam War. Although there were shorter durations of direct combat due to most of the fighting being skirmishes, and also the introduction of helicopter extractions, which got service members off of the battlefield a lot quicker than they had in the past. Obviously, there was also something that was introduced called DEROS, which was sort of the government's new plan for decreasing the amount of time that service members spent in combat, hoping that was the answer to significantly reducing the numbers of combat casualties due to psychological issues in the field. DEROS meaning date expected to return from overseas. What that did, unfortunately, which was a complete oversight by our military leadership and our government, was that it decreased unit cohesion. It also decreased the confidence in leadership, because there was already a knowledge that an individual would only spend a certain amount of time in combat or in a combat theater, and that death or injury weren't the only options to going home. During previous conflicts, excuse me, the fact that there was shared trauma, that there was really no inkling of hope that you were leaving, caused the service members to bond with one another much stronger than what you saw as a whole during the Vietnam conflict. And again, there was a loss of confidence in leadership, because even the leaders were on short durations in combat. So there was a large rotation. Oftentimes there was poor leadership because there was so little oversight on who was showing up to lead troops into battle, and the fact that some of them had little to no combat experience upon arrival. Vietnam conflict saw an extreme drug and alcohol abuse issue. More than 70% of service members were reported to have drug and alcohol issues, drug and or alcohol issues during their time deployed. And then the lack of care during and after has led to lifelong struggles that we're still seeing today, far exceeding those of previous conflicts. As far as terminology is concerned, the Vietnam era is where we saw the introduction of what we know as PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. Initially, it was called post-Vietnam syndrome, which was introduced in the late 1970s, just after the end of the official conflict. And in 1980, the term PTSD was ultimately introduced. Moving on to conflicts after Vietnam, we've now seen Gulf War, Desert Storm, Iraqi freedom, enduring freedom. Basically 20 plus years of 20 to 30 plus years of conflict in the same regions, Iraq and Afghanistan, and unprecedented circumstances, with mental health issues, for a myriad of reasons. Now you're seeing sons and daughters that are fighting the same conflicts that their mothers and fathers had in the same regions for the same reason, which obviously is increasing the lack of confidence in our ability to find a resolution for conflict. There was no foreseeable end to that type of combat, and it just kept going. And our service members were being subjected to multiple deployments to these areas. That it was determined that one of the common denominators for susceptibility to PTSD over the course of service members' time deployed was this lack of confidence in leadership. It just it led to a loss of faith, a loss of hope, and ultimately allowed for this other symptomology to compound and cause mental health issues. So you can imagine that if you're seeing years and years and years of conflict in the same region for the same reasons, there would be an extreme lack of confidence in our leadership from the top down. But now that we have a general context of how mental health has developed or progressed, dare I say progressed, over the course of American involvement in conflict, we can get to our main topic, which is military mental health and the stigma surrounding it. There's been so much misdiagnosis, underdiagnosis, and total dismissal of mental health issues over the history. of America that have plagued the military. And if from what I've discussed already, you can see the trend in how our military leadership and government address combat stress. And obviously it has gotten a little bit better over time, but ultimately it hasn't been addressed effectively. It hasn't been addressed adequately, and the moving the needle is a very slow process for this particular issue. What you're seeing now isn't necessarily a failure to address the fact that mental health exists, where you saw that in earlier conflicts where our government literally failed to recognize combat stress as a real issue, and dismissed it as exhaustion or lack of sleep or or what have you. That's since been remedied. Obviously in the last 10 to 15 years, combat stress has been addressed adequately, in my opinion. But the way that it's handled at the deck plates, within the smaller commands, is still a very big issue. And the stigma surrounding openly admitting that a service member has a mental health issue is still very much alive and well and among the ranks. For the longest time, it was impossible to even self-report. There's so much fear surrounding the risk of reprisal and just the general assumptions that are made. Once you do report, the risk of loss of clearance, removal of weapons, and the halting of your career progress are three of the bigger ones. But I mean, there's I could spend the next half an hour explaining like the fears that an individual service member might have associated with reporting that they're struggling. Our government would have us believe that everything in their power is being done to provide resources, education, and implementation of programs to offset this, to make it easier, to give service members more freedom to report. But the truth is that it's happening so slow that we're still seeing an increase in numbers of mental health issues that ultimately end in very badly. In many cases, suicide is the end result. Some of which I personally believe can be attributed to that